The idea that Western power and influence are slowly going down, possibly as a prelude to a sharp drop, has been around for a long time, but it has become more important because of recent political events, like the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. Some people think that by pulling out of international agreements, he is keeping his promise to make America great again, by putting the country's own needs first. For others, it's a risky move that could throw the whole world into chaos. In the meantime, Europe has its own problems back in the old world. But does that mean that the Western world as a whole is on the verge of collapsing? Stay with us to find out, and make sure to leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you can receive all of our freshly uploaded videos. It's not easy to use science to predict the future, especially since collapse and Western civilization are both hard to define. We talk about how the Roman Empire fell apart in the middle of the first millennium, but there is a lot of proof that it continued to exist in some form for hundreds of years after that, and that its influence is still felt today. The end of ancient Egypt was less of a disaster in which everyone died, and more of a shift in the balance of power. So when we talk about collapse, do we mean that people lose everything and go back to the Middle Ages, or that things are going to be rough for a while on the social and political fronts? The idea of Western civilization is also hard to grasp. Roughly speaking, it includes parts of the world like North America, Australia, and New Zealand, where most of the cultural norms came from Western Europe. But after that, the lines get less clear. China, for example, was built on a different set of cultural norms than that of the rest of the world. However, thanks to globalization, it is not easy to say where Western culture begins and ends. Even so, some scientists and historians are looking at the rise and fall of ancient civilizations to see if there are any patterns that could tell us what is coming. So, is there any proof that the West has reached the end of the road? Peter Turchin, an evolutionary anthropologist at the University of Connecticut, says that there are a lot of signs that should make us worried. Turchin was a population biologist who was studying the rise and fall of predator and prey animals when he realized that the equations he was using could also explain the rise and fall of ancient civilizations. In the late 1990s, he began to apply these equations to historical data, looking for patterns that link social factors such as wealth and health inequality to political instability. Sure enough, he found two cycles in the history of ancient Egypt, China, and Russia that are linked to regular periods of unrest that mark the end of an era. A secular cycle is one that lasts 200 or 300 years. It starts out with a pretty equal society, but as the population grows, there are more people than there are jobs, so labour becomes cheap. Rich elites form, while the standard of living for the rest of the people goes down. As the society becomes more unequal, the cycle enters a more destructive phase, in which the misery of the lower strata and infighting between elites contribute to social turbulence and eventually collapse. Then there is a second, shorter cycle that lasts 50 years and consists of 2 generations, one of which is peaceful and the other of which is troubled. When Turchin looked at US history, he saw there was a lot of trouble in 1870, 1920 and 1970. Worse, he thinks that the end of the next 50-year cycle, which will happen around 2020, will happen at the same time as the most turbulent part of the longer cycle. This will cause a time of political unrest at least as bad as what happened in 1970, when the civil rights movement and protests against the Vietnam War were at their height. In their book The Fourth Turning, an American prophecy published in 1997, 2 amateur historians named William Strauss and Neil Howe made a similar prediction. They said around 2008, the US would enter a time of crisis that would reach its peak in the 2020s. This prediction is said to have made a strong impression on Steve Bannon, who used to be the chief strategist for US President Donald Trump. Turchin made his prediction in 2010 before Donald Trump was elected and before there was a lot of political fighting. Since then, he has pointed out that the current levels of inequality and political division in the US are clear signs that the country is moving into the downward phase of the cycle. Brexit and the Catalonian crisis are signs that the US is not the only part of the West feeling the strain. Turchin doesn't know what will happen next. He says that his model looks at large-scale forces and can't tell what might cause unease to turn into trouble or how bad things might get. Safar Motashari, a mathematician at the University of Maryland, is interested in how and why turbulence can sometimes lead to a crash. In nature, some prey always survives to keep the cycle going, but some societies that fell apart, like the Maya, the Minoans, and the Hittites, never got back on their feet. To figure out why, he first made a model in which human populations were predators and natural resources were their prey. Then he divided the predators into two groups with different levels of wealth, the wealthy elites and the less wealthy commoners. This shows that a society could fall apart because of either extreme inequality or lack of resources. However, a collapse is irreversible only when both of these things happen at the same time. Motashari says they keep each other going. Part of the reason is that the haves are protected by their wealth from the effects of resource depletion for longer than the have-nots, so they resist calls for a change of strategy until it's too late. This is bad news for the dangerously unequal societies of the West. A recent study found that the richest 1% of people now own half of the world's wealth. Since the financial crisis of 2008, the gap between the super rich and everyone else has been growing. The West might have already run out of time. Motashari's group has shown that by quickly using non-renewable resources like fossil fuels, a society can grow by an order of magnitude more than it would have been able to with renewable resources alone. This means that the collapse of the society can be put off, but when the collapse is happening, it is much deeper, they said in the end. That sounds terrible, but not everyone thinks that the boom and the burst model works for today's world. Critics say that it might have worked back when people lived in smaller, more isolated groups, but not now. Can we really think that the US would fall apart in an internal war that would kill everyone? Scientists and engineers are working hard on solutions, and in theory, we can learn from the mistakes of other societies. Plus, globalization makes us robust, right? This goes back to what we mean when we say fall apart. Motashari's group defines historical societies based on strict geographical limits. This means that if some people survived and moved to find new natural resources, they would make up a new society. By this measure, even the most advanced societies have fallen apart, and the West could do the same. But it wouldn't have to mean the end of the world. Because of this, many scientists don't use the word collapse. Instead, they talk about a rapid loss of complexity. When the Roman Empire fell apart, new societies grew up, but their hierarchies, culture, and economy were not as advanced, and people lived shorter, less healthy lives. Turchin says that a loss of complexity across the board is unlikely right now, but he doesn't rule out a milder version of it. The breakup of the European Union or the US losing its empire through NATO and close allies like South Korea. Like the breakup of the European Union or the US losing its empire through NATO and close allies like South Korea. On the other hand, Yania Bar-Yam of the New England Complex Systems Institute in Massachusetts sees this kind of global change as a shift in complexity, with highly centralized structures like national governments giving way to less centralized, overarching networks of control. Bar-Yam says the world is becoming one big whole. Some scientists like Bar-Yam even think that in the future the nation-state will be replaced by fuzzy borders and global networks of organizations that work together. Our cultural identity will be split between our immediate areas and global regulatory bodies. Almost nobody thinks things will go well for the West, no matter how things turn out. Ian Morris, a historian at Stanford University in California, and the author of Why the West Rules, for now, says that you have to be very optimistic to think the West's current problems are just a blip on the screen. So, is there anything we can do to make it less painful? Turchin says that disaster could be avoided if the forces that keep the cycles going were changed. For example, the public debt and income inequality could be fixed by putting in place more progressive taxes. Motashari thinks we should slow down the growth of the population to levels that his model says are sustainable. The exact levels change over time depending on how many resources we still have, and whether or not we use them in a sustainable way. Thank you for watching, we hope you enjoyed our video. See you soon on a brand new update.